Texas, 1881. The late-season sun baked the dust into the wooden bones of the market town. Horses neighed, cattle bawled, and men barked over prices with whiskey breath and worn boots. It was the last livestock auction of autumn, but a crowd still lingered near the corral gate, drawn by a spectacle that didn't moo or whinny. A bay mare stood trembling, ribs sharp under her hide, flanks striped with dried blood. Beside the mare, a girl. Just behind the corral rail, barefoot in the ochre dust, she stood motionless. Her black hair hung in thick ropes across her face. Her cotton dress torn at the hem clung to her like it belonged to someone smaller. Her silence wasn't the quiet of fear, but of something older, heavier, the kind of silence that had names in old Chickasaw stories, names that meant loss. If you feel the desert wind in this kind of love story, comment number 1 below. Let us know you want more cowboy tales here at Wild West Love. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. Her dark eyes wandered, not aimless, but distant as if listening to something far away, something only she could hear. A man stood beside her. The rope in his cracked hand wasn't tied to any animal. It looped around her wrist. "A dumb one here," the drunk hollered, waving the bottle in his other hand. "Come out of my first wife, I think. Don't talk, don't hear, but she'll clean, cook, don't sass. Cheap." The men around him snorted, spat, chuckled darkly. Silas Carrion adjusted his hat against the glare. 35 years carved into his face by wind, work, and silence. He rarely came to town only for horses or salt or nails, but that morning he had seen the mare from a distance and circled back as bidding thin. He hadn't come for people. And yet, the girl looked at him, no pleading in her face, no desperation, just a long, quiet look. Still, fixed, unblinking. And something in that look stirred Silas, something he hadn't felt in years. Not pity, not lust, not even sorrow, just recognition. Like she saw the silence in him and knew its name. She wasn't white. Her cheekbones, her skin, the cold dark braid knotted tight down her back. She was Chickasaw. Silas had traded with them before, long ago. Their women carried silence like flint. Their children laughed like wind in leaves. And this girl, though clearly only half-grown, held herself like a memory too proud to be forgotten. "You got coin?" the drunk slurred. "Take the horse she comes with. I ain't dragging her back. Ain't worth the dust on her feet." Silas hesitated. The bay mare huffed and shifted in the dust. The girl's gaze didn't move. He looked at the drunk, then at the girl again. He didn't know why he spoke. "I'll take both." Laughter burst from nearby men. "You buying stock or starting a harem, Carrion?" one called. Silas said nothing. He counted coins into the man's cracked palm, enough for a horse, not near enough for a human soul. The man yanked the rope toward him one last time, but the girl flinched, stepped instinctively behind Silas, not clutching, not trembling, just choosing. "She yours now," the drunk muttered. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Silas untied the rope from her wrist and tossed it back at the man's feet. She followed him through the corral, quiet as ash. Behind them, the market began to empty. Her bare feet pressed into the clay like she belonged to the land more than to any man. When they reached the wagon, she paused. Didn't climb in, just waited. Silas opened the back and nodded. She stepped up and in, sat with her back to the rail, knees drawn to her chest beneath the threadbare shawl. He took the reins and flicked them gently. The mare moved forward. The wheels creaked like bones. They didn't speak, but as the wagon crested the hill out of town, Silas glanced back. She was still watching him, not with fear, not with thanks, just watching, as if she were still listening for something in him. The ride back to the Black Hills was long, the trail winding through canyons shadowed by birch and red pine. The mare limped but didn't balk. The girl sat beneath a blanket, face turned to the wind, eyes never leaving the distant ridge. She never looked back. Neither did he. They arrived at the ranch as the sun slipped behind the western rim. 200 acres of silence and scars. A cabin of river rock and split cedar. A barn, half leaning. A windmill that hadn't groaned in weeks. Jax helped her down from the wagon, but said nothing. She stood still, scanning the land like she was memorizing every knot of wood and sway of grass. Not afraid, just cataloging. Inside, he stoked the stove and pointed at the kettle. She moved to it like she'd known this room forever, found the tin cups, the fire iron, the ladle, poured 2 cups, no splash, no stumble, like hands taught by hunger and habit. After supper, he fished out a nub of chalk from the drawer. Tapped the doorframe. "Name?" he asked. She stared at him, long, deep. Then crouched, her fingers slow and curved, like they were shaping something precious. "Lizer." He said it out loud. "Lira." She didn't smile, but she turned toward the barn, and for some reason, he felt like he'd just been handed a secret meant for keeping. That night, Jax lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling. The wind whispered through chinks in the logs, and for the first time in years, he didn't hate the sound. He thought of her, the girl in silence, the girl with eyes like dark water, the girl who hadn't begged, hadn't wept, the girl who touched his coat like it meant something. And somewhere deep, buried under bullets and bone, he felt something shift. Not pity, not burden, recognition, like maybe the ghost in him had found another. The wagon wheels groaned softly as they rolled over the uneven path, swallowed gradually by the encroaching shadows of the surrounding pine and juniper. Up on the bench, Jax guided the mare with practiced calm, the reins taut but never tight. Lyra sat quietly in the back, her small frame curled protectively beneath a faded shawl. The twilight air was cooling, the night promised crisp birdsong and rattles of small nocturnal creatures. When they reached the ranch, it greeted them like an old Fredericks of stacked firewood, the windmill creaking gently and the low hum of the wind stirring through the grasses. The trees cast long, wavering silhouettes across the cabin's weathered logs. Jax flicked the reins and climbed down, stretching muscles that had been coiled for years. He turned and watched Lyra step out. She paused for a moment by the wagon door, her bare feet sinking slightly into the grass at the edge of the dirt yard. Then she descended with steady grace, eyes sweeping the terrain as if mapping it in her mind. He cleared his throat softly and nodded toward the door. "Come inside. We'll get some supper on." She lifted her chin and followed. Inside the cabin, wood smoke curled around the low-ceilinged room. He set a pot of bean stew on the small wood-burning stove and stepped out to fetch 2 tin cups. Outside, the sun was gone. The sky glowed a bruised purple. Lyra moved toward the stove without hesitation. The silence between them folded over the room like a blanket. She found the cups, the kettle, the ladle motions practiced, precise, resigned, and filled the cups with hot broth. Each sip steamed in the air, and the fragrance of garlic and onion wafted between them. Once the stew was gone, and the plates were set aside, Jax sank into a crooked chair, elbows resting on his knees. He watched her tear a piece of stale bread to dip in broth. Her hands were slender, scars there from chores or injury. She worked slowly and thoughtfully. "Name," he said again gently, tapping the doorframe as he had once done before. She reached for that same piece of chalk and crouched on her heels. Slowly, her fingers formed another word, emotion. He read it aloud. The word floated in the flickering glow of the lamp. Emotion. She stared at him, eyes unblinking. Then she drew again. Blurred lines, a heart inside a circle. Jax could almost hear her thoughts, the first lines of their shared grammar. The first week passed like the dull pulse of the land. They rose at dawn, fed the mare, checked fences, fetched water from the well. Jax brought a leather bucket down the well. Lyra pulled it up and poured the water into 2 tin pails. He watched the rhythm of her shoulders, the way her braids shifted with each movement. He drank his coffee slowly, savoring the silence that once threatened to suffocate him. She never spoke. She never wrote. She only listened with her stance, with the tilt of her head, with a hand laid gently on the mare's flank when it limped. One afternoon, a storm rolled over the hills unexpectedly. Black clouds gathered, and the prairie wind rose, scattering prickleweed and rattling shutters. Jax glanced at the sky, hands pausing on fence repair. Before he could speak the words, Lyra tugged his shirt sleeve and pointed toward the paddock. A perfect stillness came over her shoulders back, eyes locked on the horizon, chest rising in measured inhalations. He heard the thunder roll, long before it cracked. Within seconds, the first bolt struck an elm near the barn, splitting the trunk with a deafening crack. The horses panicked. Lyra stepped forward without hesitation, raising a palm to the biggest stallion. She stood before the rearing beast, voiceless, yet commanding. It settled. They moved them all into shelter as the rain began to hammer the roof. Jax felt something shift in him. Gratitude, awe, warmth. That night, after the storm passed and the fire sputtered low, Jax found Lyra in the barn, kneeling before the mare, her breath steady and slow, a damp cloth in hand. She wiped down the mare's flanks, her shoulders trembling from wind and relief. Jax leaned on the doorway, his chest tight with something like respect. "She's better," Lyra said once, in a soft whisper barely carried. Jax nodded. "You knew." Her eyes met his. Not wide, not fearful, just still, understanding. He crossed the floor and crouched beside her. "I'm Jax Blackwood," he said quietly. "I reckon that's enough words for tonight." She nodded, her fingers brushing his forearm with a gentle pressure that spoke volume. In the days that followed, Lyra learned the rhythm of the ranch. She sifted grain for the mare, patched leather harnesses, washed grime from Jax's hands after surgery on a sick calf's leg. Jax taught her to ride slow circles at first, his hand on her hip, his voice calm, patient. She trembled the first time the mare started a prance, but steadied herself as Jax whispered beneath his breath. Late one evening, he took her into the house. He left a folded blanket on the bed. She looked at it, then at him. He pointed to it, and she nodded. She slept soundly. In the quiet dawn, he found her writing again 2 matching images, the heart with arrows, and beside it 2 stick-figure silhouettes, their hands nearly touching. He whispered aloud, his voice rough, "Trust." Lyra only held his gaze for a long pause, then kissed the back of his hand. It was light as a feather butt. Jax felt it with unerring certainty. Weeks later, the town's murmurs drifted back. Someone called her witch. Another whispered, "Is she lapin' with coyotes?" Someone else spat, "She's Chicksaw, not even full traitor to her own kin." The insults were sharp sticks thrown into their piece. One crisp Friday evening, a group of ranchers rode in, torches in hand and hard looks on their faces. Their leader, Mr. Giles, tall as a ridgepole, spat at the porch. "You bring that savage into our valley," he said, voice low and dangerous. "We want her gone." Jax stood behind Lyra, arms folded. Moonlight glinted off his revolvers. "She didn't ask for trouble," he said, "but I reckon she ain't going anywhere." Giles spat blood on the boardwalk. "She's not white. You accepted her. Don't make a fool of us." Jax stepped forward, voice steady. "She saved my mare. She calmed your children. She's earned her place right here." Silence fell. The horses shifted. The wind stilled, as though holding its breath. Then the crowd backed away, grudgingly, without torches lit. Lyra slid a hand into Jax's as he led her back inside. No words, but the spark of unity glimmered between them. On a crisp morning, Jax brought a small wooden swing to the porch, a gift for Lyra. He had carved it himself from cedar. On it, he placed a folded clotha handkerchief of emerald green, embroidered by his mother, kept hidden ever since she died. Lyra ran her fingers over the fabric, face softening. She looked at Jax as though seeing him for the first time. Then she traced his initials on the wood, J.B. Jax swallowed. "It's yours," he said softly. Lyra leaned forward, kissed the handkerchief, and then kissed his knuckles. Life at the ranch settled into a peaceful pattern. Milking goats, mending fences, evening sittings on the porch. The silence between them grew rich, layered a language deeper than words. A tilt of the chin, a touch to the backet spoke volume. In the barn, she made tiny marks on the stall door, 3 hatch marks, then a symbol he didn't recognize. He asked once, "What's that?" She drew another linear wave, and a heart. He nodded. "Storm," he said. She nodded. No more words necessary. That winter, the first snowfall dusted the ridges. Lyra stood by the window, needle in hand, patching leather gloves for Jax. He watched her lithe profile, hair dark as fresh pine, fingers steady, jaw set with quiet purpose. He crossed the room and laid a hand over hers. The needles slipped, but she paused, looked up. There was no "thank you," just this. A moment, a suspended breath, heavier than any word. Recognition, acceptance. One evening, as twilight seeped into the cabin, Lyra turned and signed softly. "I am." Jax leaned forward. He struggled to read her lips as they formed the words, "I am no longer afraid." Tears blurred his vision. He closed the distance. "You are safe here," he whispered. She placed a hand over her heart, then over his chest. An invisible cord snapped between them. She had taught him how to listen. He had taught her how to belong. And in the hush of Deadwood Creek, their hearts began to speak. The winter sun climbed groggily over ragged hills, scattering stubborn snow patches across the prairie. Dawn mist curled through the fence posts and the low eaves of the barn. The ranch lay hushed, half asleep until a low, worried bleat shattered the calm. Jax and Lyra hurried into the barn. One of the calves' York, a bright-eyed heifer born only 6 weeks ago, was trembling, head drooping, eyes unfocused. Jax gripped her flank. "Heart's racing too high," he whispered, calling her name like a prayer. Lyra knelt beside him, her breath even. She placed her palm over the calf's neck, gauging its pulse with slow precision. Her dark braid swung over her shoulder. In the pallid dawn, her skin shimmered like polished chestnut. Before Jax could speak, Lyra signed quickly, her fingers sure and fluid. "Sick." He nodded. "How fast?" he asked. She hesitated a heartbeat, then signed again. "Spreads." "That." A cold twist sank in Jax's gut. His chest tightened, mind racing through every fence line, every hoof he'd brushed, every bucket she'd carried. In the days that followed, 5 calves and 2 yearlings fell ill. Their coats lost luster, hooves festered, and they grew listless, refusing feed. Lyra stayed by their sides, laying cloths of hot water, whispering comfort in her silent language. Jax consulted medical journals. Nothing precise, no cure, just hope and grit. Within a week, rumors from neighboring ranches reached them. Others reported strange sicknesses. The word came to Deadwood Creek in hushed voices, Lyra's curse. By the 3rd morning, the corral fence was crowded with men with mud-clacked boots and cold eyes. They stood at a distance, watching Lyra tending the calf in the barn. Their leader was Thornathy town judge, and the man who'd challenged Jax's decision to buy her now with a drawn scowl. "They're dying, Jax," Thorn said, voice calm but severe. "And so's the land. The sickness was here since that Chickasaw came. People are talking." Jax squared his shoulders. "I'll fix it, or I'll lose the herd. But she didn't bring this." Thorn pressed a finger to the fence plank. "They're blaming her. The calves collapsed after she touched them." He stepped closer. Jax felt the weight of the judge's expectation, accusation thick as sleet. Lyra emerged then, wiping her hands on her shawl. She looked at Thorn, then at the dying calf. She dropped onto rough hay with a groan of raw emotion, something between grief and exhaustion. Jax moved between them. "She's helping," he said. "She saved every one of these in the snowstorm. She didn't curse them." Thorn ignored him and pointed at Lyra. "You're a stranger. No kin, no blood. You came with your silence and your strange ways. We don't want that here." Lyra stood. She met his eye. Not proud, not afraid, just firm. She signed, slow and deliberate. "Truth." Jax cleared his throat. "She works with me. With facts, movement, what she feels under her hands. Look at her. She's spent every night by those calves." Thorn is scoffed. "That's not science." Several are drawn, mud-dark eyes flicking between Lyra and Jax. One man spit in the gravel. "Witch," he muttered. Lyra's shoulders quivered, but she didn't bow. Jax's voice boiled low and steady. "You let her work. I'll keep caring. If they die under my watch. But they're not dying because of her." The mob backed. Thorn glared. "Fine," he hissed. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Within hours after they had gone, Lyra collapsed against Jax in the barn weak, drained, her posture slumped as though the whole winter had weighed her down. Jax knelt beside her, pressing a blanket around her shoulders. "Rest," he murmured. She stared at him with tired eyes. her pulse slowing as she pressed her hand to his face, her fingers damp from the fever lingering inside her. Lyra stayed in the cabin most of the next day. Jax watched her from the porch, with unease tightening his chest. That afternoon, a low thud came from the barn. He rushed in and found Lyra, fingers pale against the wooden stall rail, pressing down on the sickest calf's swollen leg. He stood watch for hours, offering water for her lips, propping blankets around her knees. At dusk, she signed a single word, poison. He read it, trying not to choke. Someone, she signed again. Tournay. Jax closed his eyes. He covered his hand with hers, squeezing gently. The night was thick, the wind rattling boards like bones. They sat side by side across the calf, her hand over his. He tucked her braid behind her ear. I'll find out, he whispered. The next morning, Jax rode into town. The snow had finally turned to slush. He stopped at the general store and found the blacksmith, who grumbled about spare feed laced with strange salts. Jack's pride for details bags opened at night, half-burned notes found near the trough. By noon, he had evidence. Someone was poisoning the feed, testing Lyra's presence, Jax thought, not caring if they killed his own cattle. The finger traced one man, a hushed confession that morning at the smithy. Thorne had bought the feed. He'd gone to town early that week. Jax turned his mare and rode back, pace furious. At the ranch, Lyra waited by the barn door. She dressed in layers shawl, heavy shirt, long skirt smoke, dark eyes bright under dawn's thin light. Jax dismounted hard, boots clacking. She saw him come, horse bones creaking and reins swinging, and she stepped forward, hand extended. He took it without a word. The spark of their shared burden, poison, fear, resolve irradiated between them. Together, they carried feed sacks to the barn. Jax's voice was low. He did it. Lyra's eyes deepened. She signed, poisoner. He took her other hand. We'll face him. That evening, a meeting was held by the corral. Dozens of ranchers gathered. Thorne presided. Snow spun down outside, as though waiting. Ranch hands, Thorne said smugly. If you suspect me, speak. But you'll speak to me first. Jax stepped forward, stepping carefully through the mud and snow slush, Lyra at his side. The group fell silent. Him. He nodded toward Thorne. I found evidence. Feed was spiked grain from town under his purchase. Thorne laughed. Brittle. You're accusing the judge? Trader's wife now seeks justice? Lyra moved forward, hands shaking. She signed slowly. Deliberately spoke wonder and grief in the same gesture. Truth or lie? Jax looked at her. She knows. She figured it. I confirmed it. His jaw set. You betrayed a woman you never gave a chance to know. You poisoned cattle. You poisoned trust. Thorne's face spattered with snow pastes, his jaw trembling. He reached for his revolver. Jax's gloved hand hovered inches from his. But I won't let that happen. He drew. The world constricted to barrel and steel and breath, suspended between accusation and action. Thorne's posture faltered. He shook his head, stumbling on his words. No. The mob gasped as Jax rested his revolver butt down. Leave now, he said. Plead your case in court. But stay away from this ranch. From this woman. Thorne stepped back, eyes wide. The men parted. Some spit, others stared. Then, one by one, they returned to snowlight. The snow fell quiet again as Jax and Lyra walked home, hand in hand. The sickness in the calves slowed, then ceased. Lyra's calm touch, backed by Jax's protection, had turned the tide. Inside the barn, they kneeled beside the calf that had nearly died. Jax whispered its name as Lyra brushed her fingers through its coat. He looked at her, breathing hard. Thank you. She looked back, tears in her eyes. She signed one word softly, home. Jax pressed her into an embrace. She rested her head on his shoulder, warmth flooding her lean frame. And for the first time, Lyra spoke aloud, her voice cracked and low, but clear. Thank you, she said. He stilled. Her throat worked as though she were swallowing years. Thank you. Silence folded around them again, but it wasn't empty. It was love, trust, and the beginning of something that would outlast the coldest winter. The frost came quietly, as if not to wake the bones of the land already lulled into a brittle sleep. It dusted the prairie like powdered sugar, coating the tops of dry mesquite and the fence posts with the first whisper of winter. Silas Carrion's ranch lay muted beneath it, his breath curling from his nose in slow, silver ribbons as he split wood beside the barn. Inside the cabin, warmth pulsed from the iron stove, the scent of dried juniper wood mingling with cornmeal and boiled beans. Lyra stood barefoot on the braided rug, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her long black braids slipping over one collarbone like a ribbon of night. She stirred slowly, carefully, each movement deliberate, as though she were moving through water instead of air. It had been almost 3 weeks since he brought her from town, 3 weeks of silence, 3 weeks of stillness. Yet the house had shifted. She had not spoken, not once, but she listened. She listened in ways that had nothing to do with ears. She touched the wood of the doorframe as she passed, pausing as if feeling for memories carved into the grain. She stood by the window at dawn, tracing the frost with her finger, eyes following hawks gliding on the horizon. When she tended the chickens, her fingers moved with reverence, as if she were apologizing for the wire fence that penned them. Silas noticed everything, and tried to say nothing. But something in him changed the morning he found the hand-stitched pouch. It lay on the side table near the fire, tied with a strip of deer hide, embroidered with red thread in the shape of a crescent and 4 dots sewn for each direction. He picked it up gently, thumb running over the worn weave. Inside, it smelled of dried cedar and crushed blue sage. Chickasaw medicine. He knew enough to recognize it, and he knew then what she had not said with words. She had not forgotten who she was. That evening, as he sat at the table sharpening his knife, Lyra approached with a bowl of stew. She set it down before him, her eyes as unreadable as the winter sky. He nodded once. "Thank you." She lingered. Then she lifted her hand and tapped her chest. Her fingers moved slowly in a rhythm, then pointed to him. Her brow furrowed. He blinked. The rhythm again. Then her eyes, wide, waiting. And finally, she moved closer and tapped his chest too. A name. She was asking his name. He swallowed. "Silas," he said softly, voice rasping more than usual. "Silas Carrion." Her lips curved, faint as a breath. Then she tapped her own chest. "Lyra," he guessed. She nodded once. It was the first true exchange they'd had. That night, as the wind curled under the eaves and coyotes cried far off in the hills, Silas lay on his cot with one hand behind his head, staring at the rafters. And for the first time in years, he did not feel alone. By the second week of December, the snow came in earnest. Not heavy, but constanta dry, stinging powder that clung to eyelashes and turned the world to grayscale. One morning, as he led the bay mare out to drink from the trough, he spotted Lyra in the distance. She stood by the river bend, barefoot despite the cold, her hair loose and black against the pale light. She was building something. Silas walked slowly toward her, boots crunching on frozen earth. "What is it?" he asked, even knowing she couldn't hear. She looked up and smiled faintly, then pointed. A small circle of stones. In its center, 4 pine branches bent into a square. It was a winter altar, one he'd seen once before on Chickasaw land long ago, during a cattle run. A place to speak to ancestors. He stepped closer, his breath suddenly shallower. Lyra knelt and pulled something from her pucha bird skull, wrapped in braided thread. She placed it gently in the center and closed her eyes. He did not move. He did not speak. But in that moment, he understood something he never had before. Healing wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was this quiet, this reverent. As the days shortened, she began to hum. It was soft at first, no more than a vibration in her chest as she worked. But it carried a warmth that filled the cabin like firelight. A rhythm passed down in marrow and smoke, carried through centuries of women who had sung to children, to cornfields, to the stars. He watched her, as she ground maize on the matate stone he had never used. The sleeves of his flannel shirt rolled to her elbows, exposing the sinewy lines of her arms. A scar curled along the edge of her wrist, and just once, he saw her flinch when the wind slammed the cabin door. He said nothing, but he moved more softly now, closed doors gently. Saturday farther from her shadow. One night, As they sat by the fire, he brought out his harmonica. He hadn't touched it in years. His fingers fumbled the first few notes, rusty as a nail in the rain. But then the sound caught soft, old, aching. She turned slowly, watching. Then, impossibly, she hummed along, a low, rising tune. Minor, haunting. The Chickasaw scale met the Appalachian tune somewhere in between, and it held them both. When it ended, they sat in silence. Then she reached out and placed her hand over his. It was the first time she had touched him by choice. The days passed like pages turning. She painted the window panes with chalk and flour, little white deer in circles that mimicked snow. She scrubbed the floor until it shone. She began leaving bundles of herbs under the eaves protection, he guessed. He built a second fence, taller, stronger, not for cattle, for safety. Then, one gray dawn, as he was saddling up to ride into town for flour and nails, she touched his coat sleeve. Her fingers moved, forming a shape in the air. A warning. 3 fingers, 2 slashes. He didn't understand at first, but when he rode into Jasper Creek, he saw them. 2 riders, one with a yellow scarf, one with a shotgun slung low. The drunk man, the one who sold her, back in town, asking questions. He didn't stop to buy supplies. He turned the mare around and rode hard. When he returned, breath steaming in the cold, he found Lyra standing by the edge of the cabin, bow in hand. He hadn't known she had one. It was made of yew, the string sinewed tight, the arrow feathers fletched in red. She wasn't running. She was waiting. He dropped from the saddle and stared at her. "They're coming," he said. 2 men, maybe 3. She nodded once, calm, the fire in her eyes no longer afraid. That night, he loaded his rifle. She stacked wood by the door. Together, they waited, side by side, not as a rescuer and rescued, but as 2 people who had learned, inch by quiet inch, to trust what no one else had ever tried to understand. If you're still here, still breathing with us in the dust and snow of 1881, drop a 1 in the comments, and tell us, do you believe 2 broken souls can truly heal each other? Don't forget to subscribe for part 5, where the past rides back in guns blazing. The first snow came late that year. It drifted down in thin, uncertain flakes that melted on contact with the dry earth. More suggestion than season, like the land itself was hesitant to soften. Silas stood on the porch, one hand braced on the rail, the other around a steaming tin cup. Below the bluff, the Chickasaw woman moved through the field, her dark braid catching the wind like a banner. She walked with a woven basket under one arm and a shawl stitched from the winter colors of her tribe wrapped around her shoulders, reds, rusts, indigos, faded from use and prayer. He hadn't spoken to her since that morning a week ago, when she told him she needed to leave for a while. "I want to walk the old road," she'd said, signing gently with her hands when words failed her. "The land remembers before I do." He had not stopped her. He'd only nodded and said, "Take the mare, loaf." Now she had returned, but not to the house. Lyra had chosen the garden instead, kneeling in the half-frozen dirt to prune back the tough stalks of summer's corn and beans, her fingers steady, her movements precise, as though it was not the land that needed preparing for rest, but herself. Silas watched her, breath misting from his mouth. She had not come back as someone needing shelter, but as someone who had faced something old, cold, and buried, and walked out the other side. "She's not the same girl I bought," he said aloud, though no one stood beside him. And it was true. She was taller now, not in body, but in the way she held herself. Her silence was no longer hollow. It was shaped, deliberate. There was a depth to it, a knowing. It had been nearly 6 months since that afternoon in the dust-choked auction yard in Amarillo. 6 months since he had handed over a rope for a soul. 6 months since he had made space for a stranger on his land and found him slowly, against his nature making space for her in his life. In the beginning, she had slept on the floor near the hearth, curled up like a pup too afraid to stretch. He never asked questions, and she never offered answers. They'd eaten in silence, worked in silence, existed in the strange peace of people too broken to disturb each other's wounds. Then one morning she brought him water without being asked. Then she began tending the chickens. Then, without fanfare, She began to sing. It was not a song with words, just a hum. Low, steady, sad as the wind through dead prairie grass. But it carried a rhythm older than speech, and when she sang it, her shoulders loosened and her hands moved with grace. That was when he began to look at her not as someone he had rescued, but as someone who might be rescuing herself and, perhaps, in some wordless way, him too. She looked up now, meeting his eyes from below the hill. There was no smile, but she did not look away. He set down the cup and descended the slope toward her. "Leberwan, you found what you needed?" he asked once he reached her. She pressed a small sprig of cedar into his palm. The scent clung to the air between them, sharp, clean, sacred. "This grows where my mother's bones were buried," she signed slowly, fingers sure. "I sang her name there. The ground did not fight me this time." "Love." Silas nodded. He didn't pretend to understand fully, but he respected the weight of what she had done. "You went alone?" "I was never alone." Her eyes flicked up to the clouds, then toward the ridge where the hawks circled each dusk. Then, finally, back to him. "I heard you," she added, surprising him with spoken words, soft, uneven, but real. "Your heart, I heard it." He felt something in his chest tighten. She had never said she loved him. Not with words. Not even now. But it was the first time she'd spoken since that day in Amarillo, and she had chosen to say that. His throat worked. He wasn't a man of grand declarations, but he was a man who understood work and waiting. "I built the cabin for two," he said at last, gesturing with his hand up toward the bluff. "But if you want it for one, I'll sleep in the barn." A long pause. She walked to him and took his rough palm in hers, turning it over like reading the lines carved there by labor and loneliness. Then she laid it flat on her chest, right over her heart. It was not a kiss, not a promise, but it was enough. 2. The days grew short after that. December carved the valley into sharper edges. Coyotes grew bold. The stars burned brighter, clearer. Lyra worked on her own loom now. Thread she dyed with sumac and mesquite, weaving shawls that bore the symbols of her people, rivers, canoes, women walking with the moon, women who survived. Sometimes she'd trade them in the village 3 valleys down. The Mexican widow there would watch over her stand while she walked the creek bed with a sack of herbs and a switchblade tied at her hip. She never asked Silas for permission. She never had to. He repaired the barn roof that spring, built her a separate washroom out of cedar, and planted elderberry and sage along the trail she took each morning. They didn't share everything, but they shared what mattered: silence, sunrise, bread, storms. And when the second summer rolled in like a furnace, they shared the porch 2 long evenings where she sat with her feet up and he smoked his pipe, and the world was quiet enough for both of them to belong. And, one night, in late June, lightning bloomed far to the west. Not close enough for thunder, just flashes behind the clouds like war drums from another time. Silas reached over and took her hand. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. She shook her head. "I did leave. I left the part of me that wanted to die." He swallowed. "And what's left?" Her smile was slow and full. "The woman who lived." Then she touched his face, fingers tracing the scar on his brow. He never talked about the one from a Comanche raid when he was 16. Before he learned that hate is heavy and forgiveness is sometimes just letting yourself breathe. "I forgive you," she whispered. He flinched, but she didn't pull away. "I forgive you for the man you were, for thinking you could buy me, for the silence, for not knowing better." She took a breath. "And I forgive me, for thinking I was nothing but someone to be traded, for being afraid to take up space." Tears came, silent as prayer. He didn't hide them, didn't speak, just sat beside her, holding her hand until the wind turned cold and the lightning faded. Rad. When the fall came, they rode together to the Chickasaw village farther south. She went to dance. He stayed by the edge, respectful. She wore blue that day, a blue so rich it looked like dusk clinging to her skin. The children called her Lyra Bintang, Star Woman, and asked her for stories, and she told them with her hands, her voice, her eyes, told them of a girl sold in the dust, a horse with blood on her flanks, a man who didn't know how to love, and a silence that taught them both. Silas listened from afar, his hat in his lap, his eyes wet. Later, as they rode back under a sky thick with stars, she leaned against him and said, "You can stop waiting for me to leave." He looked down at her. "You sure?" She nodded, touching her throat. "Because now I can speak." Bever. Somewhere on the wind, a hawk cried. Somewhere, a fire burned. And in the house on the hill, the man and the woman sat beside each other, not speaking and yet saying everything.